Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Citrus Bites from our offices in Sevenoaks. Welcome to 2025, and firstly, thank you so much to Simon Cockfield for stepping in our December edition. And what an amazing start it's been to the year. We were straight in January with so much economic news, both in the UK and the USA. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to give us an indication of what we think might happen in the Bank of England base rate announcement coming up on the 6th of February. So at the start of the year, it really seemed to be all about inflation, both for the UK and the USA. Concerns that inflation was running hotter than expected. Trump was obviously not kind of officially in power at that time as the 47th president, but there was lots of rumors about tariffs and what tariffs might do in terms of inflation around the world. In the UK, though, we were still living the story from Rachel Reeves's October budget and the spending and borrowing plans that were announced from the government. And just a quick slide I put up, first of all, to show actually the challenge we have already in the UK is the scale of the government debt. And public sector net debt, which I'm going to show you, is running to trillions of pounds. And the challenge here is that, like anyone else that's got an overdraft, this money attracts an interest payment. So the concerns were there that given December, the government actually needed to borrow about £18 billion to make the books balance. Here we were facing already huge debt, potentially higher for longer interest rates. And of course, this debt needs to be serviced. So a certain amount of the revenue the government was looking at would have to be spent just on maintaining this debt. And that then goes into a cycle of, well, how are they going to raise the money to make sure that they can cover all the other spending commitments they've given? And would they need to go back to try and raise more money somehow, i.e. through taxes? So not a great start to the year. That was all of the story in January, all about actually we could be facing higher interest rates for longer, possibly higher inflation. And actually what we saw as a result of that was for fixed rate mortgages and the swap rates that determine kind of what lenders offer for fixed rate mortgages, interest rates going up. So those first kind of 10, 15 days into January were really thorny. And then guess what? This data, as it does, came along that actually started to douse these flames a little bit. So I'm just going to really quickly run through what was the data that's put a slightly different stance on what we might be seeing when it comes to the Bank of England base rate announcement. Well, the first one I always talk about is inflation. So really quick look on this slide, you can see there's two different figures. One is core inflation. I've been talking about that for months and months and months. This is the really sticky inflation because it excludes the more volatile areas like food and energy. So core inflation actually came down to 3.2%. As I always say, that's 3.2% positive. So prices are still going up. They're just not going up as quickly as they were. But most importantly, this is in the year to December. That's much improved compared to the year to November. So we're seeing a more tempered core inflation. And then perhaps the other metric I talk about is services inflation, which, as you can see, is running at 4.4% on a 12-month rolling. Now, compared to the previous reading, again, that was cooling. Now, remember, the Bank of England still has this 2% guide for inflation, so we're still running services inflation quite well above that. And we talk about services inflation in the UK mainly because we are typically a service country. We don't produce an awful lot. That makes it more persistent as a number, and it's less exposed to global frequencies and fluctuations. So actually, it's kind of a, if that's there as a figure, we have to work through in the UK how we tackle that services number. But importantly, both of those numbers were cooling compared to the previous reading. So that was the first bit of positive. So we've talked about inflation. The next slide I wanted to go on to was about unemployment. And again, this is something I've been talking about for a while. And unemployment actually ticked up slightly again in the most recent reading. So it went up to 4.4% from 4.3%. It doesn't sound a lot, and clearly as a number, it's not great if you're impacted clearly by unemployment. But actually, in the UK, we've just seen this persistent issue with the number of vacancies that exist. And that's been cooling rapidly over the last 12 months. And in fact, has gone down by several 100,000 vacancies over the last 12 months. And the reason this is important is because employers have been scrambling to try and attract talent. There's been such a shortage of workers and skilled workers. So what happens is when unemployment's really low, there's a shortage of skilled workers. Employers are fighting pretty much over the same talent. And typically what that results in is employers using salary or pay rises as a means to try and attract talent. So seeing unemployment tick up, perversely, is actually a positive from an inflationary pressure and a wages pressure, because perhaps there's now starting to close that pressure we had in the UK on having insufficient people to fill those roles. So just starting to see that unemployment data tick up. Where we can also see a knock-on from that is the final slide I wanted to show you today. Now, lots of colours and lots of lines, but just very quickly, if you go right to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a big spike up in the blue line right towards the end, and in the kind of purple line, a big spike down. And what happens when inflation is running higher and labour is at a shortage, so with not enough skilled labour, typically pay rises are going up to meet inflation, to try and conquer inflation. Otherwise, workers are saying, actually, these pay rises aren't making any difference to my standard of living. And then you add on the shortage of labour and trying to add even more money on. Now, what's happened recently is these jaws, as they were right there, are closing. And what that means is that more of the money, because inflation is starting to temper, more of the money from pay rises is beginning to create a positive outcome for workers. Therefore, the pay rises aren't quite as strong, don't need to be as strong where inflation's not running as high, to actually give more actual spending power to workers. So the expected continuation here will be if inflation continues to cool, unemployment continues to rise gradually. Actually, the pressure here on average weekly earnings, which has been running at like 5.5% at the moment, the increase, that's going to cool. And as that cools and inflation cools, the amount of pay rise required to actually give workers something that's a positive in their pocket that has more spending power, that will also cool. And so all of that becomes less inflationary. So those three things I've just showed you, the inflation, the unemployment, and then the real value of earnings, those three things have given the government and the Bank of England, who ultimately make the rate decision, of course, that's really doused those inflationary flames that we were all hearing about in the first couple of weeks. I think the Trump situation in the USA is still waiting to be proven. We're still waiting to see what he does. Obviously, the story over tariffs doesn't seem quite as strong as it was pre him coming into power, but no doubt more will come out over the next couple of weeks. So that's a real whistle-stop tour. The key now will be the Bank of England decision on the 6th of February. Obviously, we're going to come to you as soon as we know that outcome, let you know what's happening, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. And if that's the case, we'll update you at the same time in terms of what are we seeing about mortgage rates. Because, of course, when borrowing costs are high, which they typically are when inflation's high, that impacts so many borrowers, whether it's credit cards and mortgages, and that impacts our ability to then go and purchase items. So really important information. We'll let you know what it's looking like. I hope that's a helpful start to the new year in terms of explaining some of this wild volatility that's been going on, some of the news behind the headlines, as I would call it. And that's it for now. We've run out of time, but thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye for now.